begin to do it. And so what I'm hoping is that we'll have an opportunity to discuss perhaps some new perspectives, new thoughts, new ideas about diversity, equity, inclusion in our conversation today. And again, download into the conversation all of our various perspectives and acknowledge all of those things that have really shaped our thinking, in our actions, in our workspaces. I have a tiny bit of a lag with my computer, so I'm hoping to make that adjustment. Leslie, I can actually see you. Are you able to see the screen? Okay.
Yeah, I see your screen.
Okay, good deal. So one of the things that people ask me all the time is, why do you do this work? Why do we need to have these conversations? And I think our current present moments really speak to why the work is important, but I always like to offer a few things to really answer the question of why. Sometimes when you're in this space and you're working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it is important for you to be able to address your own why. And so these are some of the reasons why I think this work is super important, and we really need to figure out how we're going to center it into our various organizations. So one of the things that is important in working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space is to recognize that we're no longer in a position where we can just be silent. We are all positioned in some way, be it knowledge or skills or capacity. We are all able to do the work of equity. It's just a matter of figuring out where we actually need to start our own journey. But the overall perspective is we certainly need to make sure that we are engaging in centering and advancing equity so that we're no longer supporting the status quo. We also, in many ways, shouldn't hold each other, and we may not, and perhaps need to examine how we are holding each other accountable for a history that we didn't create. But what I think is most important, especially when it comes to cross-cultural alliances and how we center and advance equity, is making sure that we are all accountable for a future that we're building together. To me, that's really where the journey starts. From my own personal perspectives, it's okay, what type of legacy am I going to be leaving for the future? How am I going to work right now in my own present moments to change some things that I see are issues of equity and ensure that I've done that work, or that I've continued the work that has happened for so many decades? And Maria Teresa Kumar, she's actually a contributor for lots of news organizations, but she said this on a news program, and I thought, wow, that is a really interesting way to think about it that I had never really considered before, especially in terms of inequities being our Achilles heel. And until we really address a lot of the issues of equity in our own communities, in our spaces, in our workplaces, maybe even in our families, then it's going to continue to fester, and we're not ever going to really be able to turn the corner and make the change and dismantle the systems and the structures that continue to support adversity. And then the thing that I believe more so than anything else about why this work is important is because we are all implicated in doing the work. As long as we're human beings living in this world, we all are accountable for the substantive changes that we create or not create. And as we can see in our, throughout our local, regional, national community, or the national dialogue and our national conversations, none of us are inoculated. It's affecting all of these things that are happening right now are affecting each and every one of us personally, and certainly as parts of larger social groups. So those are some of the whys. And again, I think it's important to really kind of figure out why all of these things are important for you, what speaks personally to that importance. So when you're in this space and when you're doing this work and when you're having these conversations and when you are engaging in all of these different dialogues, there are some certainties, and then there are also some ways in which we are implicating each other to do the actual work. A great colleague of mine, Dear Littleton, says all the time that, when you're working in these spaces, it's about calling people into the process and not calling people out. And so and I really took that on and adopted that, because it really is about how are we actually calling each other in to the process. And so one of the things that you really should be certain, that is a certainty, that is going to just happen, is this idea that we're listening, and we're listening to the stories, the narratives, the history, the ways in which all of our intersectionality and the ways we are, the narratives that we tell about who we are, how all of our beliefs and our value systems have really shaped who we are. And we're listening for that. We're not necessarily listening to respond or listening to dismiss or disagree, but we're listening so that we really can accept those particular narratives. There are a lot of times in this space that you're going to be uncomfortable. The phrase that we hear often is lean into discomfort. I actually adopted the phrase embrace the discomfort, because I think there's something different about when you're leaning into a space and when you are embracing something. To me, leaning in is almost like, kind of playing the hokey pokey. But when you're embracing something, you're putting your arms around it. And if you're not comfortable with what you're putting your arms around, then you're going to do something about it. Or you embrace it and you hold it closer. So I think there's a different mindset or different connotation to when we are embracing something that we're not comfortable with. Challenging protectionism, decentering self, all those two things they're more implications than I think they are certainties. So the whole idea of protectionism is sometimes when we hear things or we experience things, or when someone is challenging a perspective or an ideology, we tend to kind of constrict our boundaries a little bit, and we want to protect those things that have shaped us. And I think there comes this thought process that perhaps we're losing something. And what I would just offer is that for all of the things that you believe you might be losing, think of all of the things that you're potentially gaining. Better understanding, deeper understanding, greater connection, or more authentic experience. For this time that we're together, and then also when you are just engaging in these conversations, to share the airspace is important. So that's why I really try to build in a lot of opportunities for you all to discuss and share your stories and your histories, and then being respectful of each other's stories and narratives and histories. Most importantly, an implication for me, or from me to you, is to be that influencer. Influence your circles, influence your micro circles, your macro circles, whoever is in your social settings, your workplace, your ethos. You are an influencer in all of those spaces. And so while the conversations might be difficult or challenging, I do hope that there will be something said today, something that's shared today in this session that will help you navigate those particular spaces. So my work really revolves around 3 pillars. So yes, I do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, but my perspectives really are grounded in humility, inclusion, and equity. So humility specifically, done a lot of work on the intersection of cultural humility and civility. But for me, the ways in which we define humility have always been this whole idea of freedom from arrogance, or freedom of arrogance. But it's also expanding that definition to the assumptions and the acidic commentary that we have about others, or that we share or we express about others. I think we all have some assumptions or some biases, that we have. We may all at some point in our lives have engaged in some sort of stereotype or stigma, but it's really making sure that we are intentional about examining that or exploring some of those assumptions, and then trying to retreat from engaging in a lot of acidic commentary, because that really doesn't get us anywhere. And oftentimes all it does is really create more confrontation, more collisions, as opposed to just trying to figure out what another person is saying or how their experiences has really shaped their lives. And then there's inclusion and equity, and those are things that we hear a lot about. From my perspective, however, equity really is about justice, fairness, and impartiality, and how we begin to operationalize equity in our own spaces. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have a conversation about some big concepts, and then we're going to dig down a little bit more into some information about those concepts. There will be, again, lots of opportunities for reflection, and then hopefully you all will be taking away lots of different strategies, activities, and maybe some different thinking about cross-cultural alliances, diversity, equity, inclusion, and specifically how to engage in debiasing by design. All right, so the first thing I want to just share with you all, this is something that I think is really important to the conversation around, specifically around diversity and around this whole idea of cultural competency and cultural proficiency. So here's the deal. Oftentimes when we have these conversations, we engage in training and workshops and webinars, or we feel as though we have evolved or we've moved along this continuum to where we feel really proficient and we feel that we've reached a level of competency. Here's the thing, culture evolves and it's shaped differently by different experiences, by different actions, different thought processes, different perspectives. And so because culture is something that continuously evolves, there's not really this sense of proficiency or competency because those things often sound very final. But cultural humility really speaks to how we are constantly engaging and understanding ourselves and others so that we can have those really honest, whole, and authentic relationships. So I always like to bring this whole continuum into focus a little bit because sometimes I think we, at a point, probably a couple of decades, have been talking about this whole color blindness and those sorts of things. And we've moved away in some instances from that. But the whole idea of competence, you might be competent in a certain thing for a certain point in time, but then you'll have a new experience. And so that evolves, that deepens, that grows. And so I just want to kind of drop that into the conversation as we move a little bit forward. So there are lots and lots and lots of issues of equity. Now, of course, I'm, college education, teacher education professor. And so a lot of the issues of equity that I deal with are really from an educational perspective. But we know that there are lots of issues of equity across all sorts of disciplines and all, across all aspects and systems and structures of our lives. One of the things, though, that's really important when we talk about an issue of equity is for many students, where does this actually begin? And for many children and many people, where does this actually begin? And there's a lot of research right now, a lot of emerging research that really speaks to how a lot of the biases that we have begin in those very early years. There's about 6 or 7 pieces of research that I've read the last, I want to say, year or so that specifically talks about disciplinary action, disciplinary structures, school expulsion rates, how all of that really is predicated on a lot of biases about behavior very early on, especially for African-American boys and Latinx boys. And many of them begin to experience a lot of these biases as early as 3 years old. And it continues throughout their school experiences. The other issue of equity, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is sometimes diversity is conflated with equity. And those two things are absolutely very, very different. But we know that there are lots of issues when it comes to equity across all aspects of our society. We know that it's very difficult sometimes to engage in conversations about race. Leslie and I were involved in racial conversations about race and inclusion in the spring. And I think, one of the things that I really took away from that is how difficult it really is to engage in some of these conversations. Derwin Sue calls it race talk. So it's oftentimes very, very difficult, but we need to engage in those conversations regardless of how uncomfortable those conversations can be. Another issue of equity, specifically that cuts across all different systems and structures, is the ways in which we are responding to something that has happened. And we are engaging in a lot of corrective policies. And sometimes those corrective policies are not substantive because we really haven't done the work to change what's happening in the background or underneath. So it appears that we're doing this really great and wonderful stuff. We may have what's called the diversity boutique or a lot of window dressing, but we really haven't dealt or disrupted or interrupted even the systems and the structures that are creating a lot of these inequities that we've now responded to. So we've got to dismantle some of that, but that's a process and it takes a while to actually get there. Some other issues of equity that I just wanted to kind of bring into the conversation that really starts from those school experiences and follows a lot of folks into their adult lives and into their careers. Right now we know, and the national statistics are that most K-12 students are students of color. However, most teachers, administrators, counselors are not, and about 7% or less are Black and Latinx or identify as Black and Latinx, and only about 2 to 3% are actually African American or Latinx men. Now, typically we see higher concentrations of people of color working in larger metropolitan areas. But what we know is that while that in itself is not necessarily an issue of equity, what is how we are all coming together in these school systems and in these spaces and identifying or describing or defining who goes where, who has access to what resources are available. And those become the issues of equity, especially in education. The other piece of that is what I was talking about before, the ways in which we're creating allyships or allies or alliances within these systems, particularly within the educational system, that can really, really ground for a student what their experiences are like post their K-12 experiences. So I want to just give you guys a moment to just have a little bit of silent reflection to think about some of that information that's been shared already. And then certainly add to the conversation after that time, any trepidations, any tensions, any thoughts that you all might be having about the information that's been shared so far. And then maybe if there's anything that's igniting an interest for you to learn more. So take just about a minute and then feel free to unmute yourself and add to the conversation.
Dr. Barnes, may I?
Of course.
Okay, so I wanted to address what trepidations or tensions might you be feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And as a woman of color, I think one of the harder things that I have been experiencing and the tension that I have felt are for those who seem to be insensitive to the issues of equity, or those who say there is no social injustice or racism doesn't exist, or those
Sure.
sorts of things. That's been a very difficult area for me because I am trying to grow and trying to learn and to see both sides. Sometimes I feel like it's unfair that I have to open myself up to understand the other side, but I understand in order for us to make some groundwork, I have to do my part in that area, even though I may be a person on the receiving end of it.
Yeah. I completely understand that perspective. One of the things that I found has been really, really helpful when I'm having that type of conversation is, I'll ask people, well, tell me why. Like, basically, show me your receipts. Why do you believe that? Why do you think that? Where does that come from? Source that for me so that I have a better understanding. Because it is very difficult to hear some of those, that type of ideology or that type of rhetoric about what doesn't exist when you may have either a personal experience or you see it, or you're carrying some sort of generational or historical trauma because of what we're actually seeing in our present moment. So it's really, really difficult to have that conversation. But what I have found has helped to open that door just a little bit more is, okay, help me understand why you believe that to be true. Now, typically, the answers have to do with something that is so far beyond that individual person. They just believe what they've been told or what someone has shared with them, but there's not a real personal connection to why they believe that. It's just, well, this is what it's always been. This is the status quo. This is how it is. I don't see it. It doesn't exist. Or one person of color said it didn't exist. So that means no person of color has that experience. So sometimes, it's about really having that conversation. And here's the thing, in some instances, we just have to accept that we're not going to be in agreement. There's not going to be any closure to it. And that's okay, because it really is about, let's continue to have the conversation. because I may not ever be able to bring you over to my side. But I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation for sure.
And for me, this is Judy. For me, I have not, I can't feel what you feel. And
Sure.
so I've not been in your place. And, you know, my husband calls me Pollyanna because I always want to think the best of people, right? But knowing, I mean, I remember being in a room where I heard an African American mother say how frightened she was every time her son left the house in a car.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I had raised 3 boys, and sure, I had fears. I had fears they would do something stupid. It never occurred to me that they would be harmed in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that for me is just my inability to completely understand, which is part of the reason that I want to continue to participate in these conversations.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that, because I think what in you know, this is just me paraphrasing a little bit of what you're saying, but it's the unknowing, or the not having the personal experiences. So it's a little time, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to recognize what that looks like and what that might feel like for someone. But that's, you know, that's a great place to be in some instances, because it really just means that you are really trying to be empathetic.
Hey, this is Randy. I want to touch just a little bit on what Jasmine said, just from my perspective of what I've talked about here at work and at home and with my kids is, you know, when you're having these conversations, you're probably not going to change most of the people, the older people's minds. They're set in their generational decisions, but
Mhm.
we're really doing more than anything else too in the bigger picture. We're planting seeds for future generations.
Mhm.
These conversations are happening, that we are being aware that, hey, there are some things that, you know, maybe they're not as extreme as what different groups may portray it, but there's a problem, you know, and so let's meet in the middle somewhere here, and let's have these discussions. And then as those kids are hearing that and they're growing up talking about it, hearing rational conversations, you know, that's the change is going to be, you know, won't be tomorrow. Nothing changes that fast. It's any good. You know, anything that changes that fast is irrational, and it washes away quickly, it seems like. But you know, but it's really setting a really good, solid foundation that's going to be grown on. If we can have those conversations now, so the next generation has fewer of these conversations, because there's fewer of those things going on. There's always going to be an issue between humans. It's humans. But if we can have those conversations now and not focus so much on, I'm going to change your mind regardless of how you feel, but more of, I want you to at least think about it so your kids are thinking about it, because their minds are still open for decisions.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting idea, because there is that whole, well, I'm going to do everything I can to completely change your mind, because you really need to see it from my perspective and my perspective only. Well, that in most instances will not happen. But if you are at least willing to say, you know what, let me try and decenter myself from being the most important person in the conversation, so that I can really hear what you're actually saying, so that I might have a better understanding of the experience from your perspective on both, you know, on all sides, and for any issue of equity. Because I think there's information about each other that we don't know. We don't know everything there is to know about a person. Some of us don't even know all there is to know about ourselves, right? So we're constantly having to engage in, okay, well, let me just kind of figure some things out. And it's a little bit of a balancing act, but I do think, at least what I'm seeing from a lot of my college students and generation, where are we now? The millennials and Generation X, in LMNOP, whichever the generation is, what we have right now, I think they are so much more open to having the conversations, because what I'm hearing a lot of them say is, this is just wrong. Like all the stuff that's going on right now, it's wrong. And we want to do something to fix it. Now, they may not necessarily know what to do to fix it, but they at least recognize this is wrong, and we're just not going to engage in this anymore. We don't want to do this anymore. I think that's kind of moving the needle a little bit. Are there other thoughts and reflections?
I loved this statement. We can hold each other responsible for history that maybe we didn't create, but we must hold each other accountable for a future we build together. I love that.
Yeah, in that, you know, it's when you think about it, it's like, well, I unless I get in a hot tub time machine, I can't go back and change anything in history. I would like to, but I can't. But what I can do is something about our present moment and moving forward. Absolutely. That I can hold myself accountable for. And I can certainly implicate others in calling them in to do that work alongside of me. All right, so let's move on a little bit, and we're going to get into what is this whole cross-cultural alliances. Now, certainly, you know, you put those words together and you're like, okay, well, I get that. That totally makes sense. But there are a few things that I want to just add to the definition or the way in which cross-cultural alliances and creating a cross-cultural alliance can be characterized. So this whole idea of being an ally, this is a very personal journey. It's a very reflective journey. It can be very transformative. It allows us to engage in a lot of introspection to really figure out who we are, and then who we are to each other. And so sometimes when you are holding a position or you are creating a position of being an ally, it is also important that you then figure out, are you advocating? Do you have an empathetic response? Now, empathy really is three different types of ways in which you might have an empathetic response. So there's the cognitive empathy. So you're really kind of thinking about the information or someone's history or narrative or their experience. There's the emotional empathy, which is the connection that you may personally have to someone else's experience or to someone specifically. And then there's the compassionate empathy, which means you are engaging and doing something to create the change. So you certainly can hold yourself to a position or to a status of being an ally, but there's also something to be said about what is the empathetic response that then helps you to create this or deepen your commitment to the work, to continuing the learning, to advancing or deepening your own knowledge about self, others, experiences, narratives, histories, all of this stuff. And also the cultural, the ways in which we exercise our cultural agility. So we'll get into the cultural agility a little bit later, but cultural agility really has to do with how are we moving in and out of different spaces. And then how do we understand what it is like to be a person in a different space that is something that's perhaps not something that I'm used to. And then being comfortable in that space and being very authentic and genuine in whatever that space is. And then it's the whole idea of getting to the alliance. So the alliance really has more to do with how are we building structures? How are we weaving threads of cross-cultural cultural humility? How are we building that or weaving that into our organizations? Are we organizing around some sort of change or some sort of issue of equity? Like, what are we doing to create an alliance of people, like-minded people who are, engaged in thinking, action, and behavior towards a greater good? Like, what is it that we're actually doing all together? So that's the way in which cross-cultural alliances is really characterized. And I think there are probably ways in which we see ourselves and maybe people in our communities and our workspaces who we might identify as having one of these elements. I always like to say that, to me, once you start saying, okay, I'm going to be an ally, and then it's, okay, what are you going to do as an ally? Are you advocating? Are you creating allyships? Are you creating alliances? Are you doing both? Is it a little bit of both, or are you really focused on one thing? You might be an advocate for someone or an advocate for a specific change, but your ability to actually, your capacity really to do the work might require you to be committed to doing the work. And it might require you to engage other people in doing the work. And so, you know, it's not a flash in the pan kind of thing. It requires you to be all in, and you really want to figure out who you are to other people, who you are in different spaces, who you are in like spaces. All of that really kind of helps ground this whole idea of cross-cultural alliances. One of the things that's important about the whole concept is that it's really about the people, and then it's how the people are branding the policies, the practices, and the processes, because we got to do both. A lot of times what I hear, especially from younger folks, is, okay, you know, these are all of the things that are happening to me. These are the things that are wrong in our world. These are the things that we want to change. But complaining about it doesn't change anything. There's got to be some action. You've got to change the policies, the practices, and the processes that allow some of these inequities to grow and flourish. Because what we want to do is to allow equity to grow and flourish, not the inequities. So where do you think you are? How would you maybe characterize where you are, or where you are perhaps even in your organization, or maybe in a particular social group? Like, do you see yourself more as an ally, but an ally who is also advocating, or an ally who is really engaged and committed to doing the work and the change and to the learning? Or are you in the process of, or a part of, an organization that has created the alliances so that those systems and those structures are being dismantled, or there's at least a process by which you're dismantling or interrupting a system of equity and changing the policies and the practices that may have allowed inequities to grow? How would you kind of characterize your own being? And I'll go back just so that you all can see those elements.
I think I fit in all of them, but in the last year, I became state director of an organization that is really working on policies and building alliances. And so as somebody who has really worked hard to be an ally, an advocate, and continues to work hard, I recognize that the work needs to be done, and am excited to be working in that direction, but admit that it is so intimidating, and that I have a lot of hesitance to make sure that I'm doing it in a way that's sensitive. And I recognize that I'm a white girl speaking to, within our organization, predominantly white girls, about the need for diversity and equity. And so I want to make sure that we're not doing that in an insulated, insensitive way. But when we lack voices of color in our system, it's hard to listen within the system. Now, I will say Jasmine on this call is a great addition to our system and organization, and has been an unbelievable asset, and I'm so thankful for her. But I also don't want to put burden on people to carry to be the only ones passing the needs and the messages just because they are a person of color. That's not fair either. Sure. So all of that ramble to say it's intimidating, and but we'll keep going.
I don't think that was rambling at all. I think that just spoke to all of the parts and the pieces. Because I do think we may find little bits of us are in each one of these, elements of cross-cultural alliances. And we may not be, by our own self-analysis, we may not be fully engaged in all of these things, but there might be areas where we are perhaps a little bit more engaged than maybe others. The one thing that I will say about the whole idea of being an ally is recognizing that saying you're an ally doesn't mean that you're actually doing any of the work. Like, you've got to actually do some work. And that's what's important. And it's hard work, because you want to make sure that you are being very authentic and genuine to how you are engaging the work, and how you're engaging others in the work, and how folks feel like they are a part of and valued within the system, and that their voice is valued. And those things can be difficult, but it's important that all of those voices, all those perspectives are central to creating the corrective changes, the policies and the practices and the procedures that really advance equity. One of the things there's a certain cultural taxation that many people of color experience when we may be the sole or the only voice, particularly in white spaces. And we feel as though we are carrying a little bit of a burden to really address and answer all aspects of Blackness or the Black experience, which is why a lot of us who are working in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, I am very good about front loading to say, I can tell you about my experience, and I can tell you about my personal experiences. I can probably help you understand the experiences of other people who look like me, but recognize that there's an intersectionality to their lives that I don't know anything about. And I think sometimes when we start to think about those kinds of perspectives, and that goes for everybody's life. Everybody has a way in which their lives are intersected that are not like anybody else's, right? Because we have our own stuff. So it's recognizing that there is no monolithic experience to the way anyone is intersecting their lives, or the ways in which they can add to the conversation. Okay. All right. So I know that you guys are adding some comments to the chat. I actually can't see the comments right now. So we'll take a break, and then hopefully I'll have time to read those comments, and then I'll bring those comments into our discussion. All right, so cross-cultural alliances, allies, allyship, advocacy, and then building those organizations, those structures, those systems. So the frame through which cross-cultural alliances really work is diversity science. Now, diversity science is it's an emerging theory, approach, way of thinking that was introduced about 12 years ago through Victoria Plout's work, P-L-A-U-T, Victoria Plout. And then since then, there's been many other researchers that have started to look at diversity science. So we're going to use diversity science as the frame by which we really dig a little deeper into cross-cultural alliances. With diversity science, there's this underpinning of explaining the difference between diversity and equity. Diversity, for most of us, we don't have any problems with identifying diversity. Diversity is that representation and the equality. Diversity over the last about 20 years has really been trending a little bit more symbolic, but here's the thing about the symbolism of diversity. It goes back to what I was saying about window dressing and the diversity boutique. It looks real pretty. It's all this great, really wonderful programming, but behind the scenes, you haven't really done the work of equity, so it's not substantive. So symbolic diversity also leans into the space of marginalizing or tokenizing people of color. So the fact that we are still in this country dealing with the first person of color, or the only person of color, we're still kind of dealing with those issues. Recognize that that's really about symbolism, and that in many ways is tokenizing, and we're not really doing that grounding work of fairness, justice, and impartiality that equity calls us to do. The ways in which we then operationalize diversity or operationalize equity is by dismantling and disrupting the systems. So the Disruptive Education Equity Project talk a lot about, they have introduced the founder, Dr. Darnisa Armante Jackson, introduced she calls it her DBIE continuum, where you look at diversity, belonging, inclusion, and then equity being the very last thing, because equity is very difficult to achieve. And through her research, she suggests that equity for any organization really takes about 10 years, because you really are talking about, first of all, how are we centering equity in our own personal lives and our own spaces, and then moving through this continuum to where people feel like they belong, and then people's voices are included in creating some of the policies and practices. And then you're grounding those policies and practices through equity and disrupting the systems or the status quo that may have existed that creates inequities. That's a process, and it takes a while to actually get there. So while yes, the symbolism, that I take nothing away from that, but we can't just rest on symbolism. It has to be more in order for us to enjoy having a more equitable world and more equitable spaces. So when we look at diversity through diversity science, I really think about it as a way in which we are detoxing our thoughts and our ideas about diversity. So here's the deal. This is what I know for sure. We can categorize, we can name all these various categories of diversity. And oftentimes what happens is people will say to me, okay, yes, I know what diversity is. And they'll, name all these, hey, it's race, it's identity, it's sexual orientation, it's religion, it's gender. Okay, now I know what diversity is. Well, those are categories. For many folks who work in the DEI space, when you can identify various categories of diversity, that's actually pre-diversity. When you are engaged in recognizing the representation and defining equality, that is really where you get to the diversity. And so it is about representation, and it is about understanding how people are representing themselves across all categories of diversity. That's a little bit different than just naming and identifying the different parts or different labels, diversity labels. Through diversity science, though, there are about 3 or 4 things that I'll download into the conversation for us today. But I really want to start with this whole idea of power imposition, because it lays a little bit of the foundational work for much of what we're going to talk about a little bit later, and certainly some of the activities. Power imposition is a concept that I read about Daryl Ring-Su's work. And he talks about this whole idea of power imposition. Now, this is a passage from the book. And this is the way in which he talks about power imposition as it relates to K-12 education and beyond. So I'll give you a little bit of the high notes here. I know some of you guys may have an opportunity to, or maybe looking at your screens to read it, but for those of you who just kind of need some high notes, what he talks about with power imposition is that it is a pathology by which we begin to assimilate and dismiss our own cultural being so that we can assimilate into what's considered a majority culture. However, this pathology of power imposition in many ways, especially in, through our school experiences and beyond, can allow for this idea of how we are promoted into different aspects and within school, educational opportunities, who can be a part of different sports, or who are the students who are promoted into different sports or different extracurricular activities, or students who are in advanced placement, their preparedness for being in advanced placement. But then it also really then moves into the ways in which we are engaging in career choices, or our appearance in these in professionalized spaces. Who actually develops all of these professional standards that we're holding ourselves accountable to? The ways in which we are engaging language, our vernacular, or standard American English, whatever we want to call that. And then the whole concept of cultural agility, the way we're moving in and out of various cultures, or being a part of different cultures and being authentic to ourselves in all of these spaces. And then especially for people of color, the ability to do a lot of code switching. So all of these things really have a lot to do with the ways in which we are making these or engaging in having these really authentic and genuine connections with each other, and how there is a certain power structures in this country, that that pushes this narrative forward that everyone needs to assimilate into whatever is deemed appropriate. We see a lot of this in certainly our laws and policies and practices in K-12 education. We see a lot of this across all any other industry. There, are certain ways in which you can and should appear to be professional in corporate America. There are ways in which you are professionalized for your professional appearance, or the ways you are professionalized as a medical professional. So all of these different ways has to do with the power structure and the way in which power is imposed and the pathology of assimilation into this majority culture. So I'll stop right there because I do want you all to have an opportunity to kind of reflect on that. This is going to be really one, and I think I'll get through the second one, and then we'll do a breakout group where you guys can talk about this. Oh, let me also make sure that you all have the document in the chat. It's a Google Doc that has this particular passage and then the next passage that I'll talk through really quickly, and then we'll go into a breakout room where you guys can have some more small group conversations, and then we'll come back and talk about it as a whole group. So the second thing that I'll bring into the discussion for right now is this whole idea of color blindness. Now, this is also from Darwin Sue's book, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. And this is a direct passage from the book, and I thought it was such an interesting, just an interesting idea, because I think, I really started experiencing and hearing a lot about this whole phrase, color blindness. I don't see color, those kinds of things, back in the 80s and 90s. And I think it was a way to, as he talks about in this particular passage, it was a way to try and resolve or just speak to and address some of the differences that people may have, and just to say, no, I don't see color, everybody's the same. Research now speaks to the fact that when we start to engage those kinds of, that kind of ideology about color blindness, it really does not help to advance social justice or equity issues, because that may be a part of a person's identity. And when you don't allow that person to tell the story about what it is like to be in their skin or to look like they do, then you dismiss a part of who they are, potentially can dismiss a part of who they are. A recent conversation I had with a researcher who's doing some research on the idea of cultural envy, really draws upon a lot of work from James Baldwin's essay about defining whiteness, and how there's this whole idea that many people, that all people who actually came to this country, not the people who are already here for centuries, but you came to this country, white or Black, by our definitions that we have now. And we adopted these terms and phrases based upon the structures and the systems that were put into place. But one of the things that is in the essay that this particular researcher draws upon is this whole idea that no one actually came to this country as white, and no one came to this country as Black. We all had some sort of ethnicity. And for some within this country, there certainly was a structure that was grounded, that allowed people who now consider or maybe identify as white to actually assimilate into that, and then to get rid of, in another way, to actually retreat from their ethnic identity. Whereas Black people who identify as Black now, or African American, or descendants of slaves, did not give away those ethnic identities, but then had to create a whole different culture that was a part that actually included lots of different cultures. So his research is actually, Dr. Thomas's research is actually on this whole idea of cultural envy and how that really plays into this whole idea of culture of color blindness. And we don't want to see color and everybody's the same. And while certainly to a degree, yes, we're all human, but there are certain stories that we tell about some of our experiences as that address our race and our ethnic background that also need to be understood, told, and acknowledged. So I'll offer you all of that information. And I do want to give you all an opportunity to just have some small group discussions about it. So the link that you all have is a document that has this passage and the previous passage on power imposition. And so really what I would like for you all to do is just have some small group discussions, one about any experiences that you may have had with color blindness or your thoughts about the whole concept of color evasion. And then any thoughts that you may have about power imposition. So what I'll do is I'm just going to stop my share so that I can actually get you guys into your breakout groups to have those conversations. And we'll spend about, I'll say about maybe 8 minutes and maybe 6 minutes in the breakout groups for those conversations. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of your thoughts and ideas in those breakouts. So I think, Leslie, are there about 20 people, I think? Okay.
Yeah, that includes you and me, but yes, there are 20.
Okay.
Hey, Leslie and Dr. Barnes, don't include me because I'm getting ready to step away in just a second.
Oh,
so
okay.
I just want to make sure you knew that.
Okay. Oh, I think I still ended up doing that. Okay, that was TJ. Let me take TJ out of the room. How do I move TJ back to the main room? Okay, so now that we're all back, what were some of the conversations like in your small groups? What were some things that resonated with you all?
Mhm. Yeah,
Dr.
but
Barnes,
I can close it.
can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes.
This is Janice Daniels. In our breakout group, one of the things that TJ was in that, and one of the things he talked about was as being a white male, that he's just taking the initiative to talk with his white friends about implicit biases. He said, because, you know, it's not like you just wake up thinking that every day. It's just what you do is just comes natural. And so he said, you know, like if they're sitting around watching a ball game or something, and if a commercial comes on, he'll just use that time to bring up the conversation and just have the conversation and just to have people thinking about it. And I think that's what we all need to do, is just continue having the conversations.
Yeah. Thank you for offering that.
I'm April. We were in room 5, I believe, but we had just really gotten to the conversation about the whole colorblind thing. And I shared with my group that I feel like what people are trying to define or exemplify as colorblindness is something that I grew up with. Like I had parents who kind of sheltered me from a lot, and I grew up in a very rose-colored world. Didn't learn about systemic racism and injustices and things until much later in life. My mom is pretty fair-skinned, like a very light-skinned Black woman. She's got a lot of white on her side of the family, and my dad's about my complexion. But we never, we learned stuff, but we weren't really taught about or exposed to those things when I was growing up. And it's even harder to believe that I grew up in Alabama and people are like, how did you not? That's just at the Jackson house. We were just it was very positive, very we just did not really talk about or experience those things. Yeah. But I was thankful that I learned about it much later. And I was like, I think what I experienced, like a person being a person and not really knowing about ethnic backgrounds and the change in American history and all of those things that play into a factor of how we've gotten to the spot that we're in now, is what some people really want as colorblindness. Like they want to believe that it didn't happen this way, or that, or try to say that they didn't. And I think now there's no way for you to say that you don't know or you're unaware. There's too much knowledge out there, and there's too many blatant things going on in front of us. So myself and Jasmine, I think our other partner in the room was Elizabeth. We had just really began the conversation, and then it was kind of time to wrap up. So Jasmine was talking about the opposite, that she lived the complete opposite of the life that I lived, and we went on from there.
Okay. Thank you for that. Other thoughts, ideas? The whole idea of colorblindness is such an interesting thing, because I have my own personal history with the concept of colorblindness. So I actually grew up in mostly, now I know this, it never really resonated with me then as it does now, but I grew up in mostly white spaces, all white schools, majority white communities. I was in at a school, and I think the first time I realized that color was a little bit of an issue was when I, had an encounter with a young woman. I think we might have been in the 7th or 8th grade. And my friend circle were folks who lived in the neighborhood with me. So, there may have been a couple of us 3 of us who were of color, 2 African-Americans, one, I think he was Mexican-American. But everybody else in our little friend circle, they were white. But, we kind of knew who we were. We knew who we were as a part of our families, and we knew who we were as a part of this social structure. And it was so interesting, and I will never forget this. One day in the cafeteria, a girl came up to me who happened to be students who were bused to the school. So that made it, completely different. So now we're talking about all these different systems and structures and all this stuff. And she said to me, "You must be rich." I didn't even know what she meant. Both of my parents are teachers. There's no rich nothing going on around there, right? So I was like, what are you talking about? Well, you must be rich in order for you to have those folks as your friends. And it never, and I thought that was the weirdest thing for anybody to say to me. But later in life, I realized what she was saying, that the only way I would have been able to fit into this particular space and to navigate these spaces is if my family had money. So it's a very, very interesting thing to come to reckon with a little bit later in life. So all of these things about color and color evasion and color blindness and power and position and who belongs where really plays itself out in various systems and structures across, really across our country and across our society. So it's always very interesting when you start to dig down into that, and then some of the historical framing around color, color blindness, colorism, color evasion, and all those sorts of structures. So I want to just kind of quickly move a little bit quicker, because I didn't realize it was 2:08. So diversity science, there are three things I really want to offer to you guys for this part of the conversation about diversity science, just to give you a different frame of thinking about diversity. So diversity science, as I said before, is a concept that was really introduced about 10, 12 years ago by Victoria Plout and through her work. Basically what diversity science scientists believe is that we really need to look at how our human differences are both constructed and structured. So the constructed perspective has to do with our social and our cultural connections, and then the structured piece has to do with the emotion and the psychology. And so when you're looking at the ways in which all of our intersectionality of who we are and all our various human differences come from both a social and a cultural perspective, and perhaps an emotional, I'm sorry, I think I said psychological, but it's psychological and biology. So our social and our cultural perspectives, and then also our psychology or psychological and our biological perspectives. So that's the structure piece. When we look at how all of those things really come together, it really speaks to who we are. And then we then have an opportunity to tell someone else about our particular story. And when you're looking at it from that perspective, it is less likely that you're going to, according to a lot of the research, it is less likely that you're going to dismiss the constructed piece, because you understand what that means for how someone is structured, and the responses, the biological responses or implications, the psychological effects. A lot of the work that Victoria Plout does actually undergirds much of the theory around post-traumatic slave syndrome, and the ways in which we have internalized a lot of messages about who we are and who other people are. The other thing that I want to just say about diversity science, I want to show this because it's such a really, really cool 8-minute video, and I think we may have time for this. Yes, we do. It's a really interesting TED Talk, 8-minute TED Talk. Brittany Barron is the person who's presenting, and she talks about two things in particular. One, about this 10,000 hour rule and how it really applies to equity. And the other thing she talks about is the ways in which we internalize messages about ourselves and others. So I want to just play this really quickly, and I won't play the whole thing because I want to, kind of get to some other concepts and ideas. But I think this also helps ground and deepen the conversations around how do we actually begin to create these cross-cultural alliances. So I'm going to, first of all, I need to make sure that I'm sharing my audio.
So the year was 1999. I was 13 years old. The location, a sleepover with all of my best girlfriends. The occasion Well, the new Destiny's Child album, The Writings on the Wall, had just come out. And we felt like listening to it for an entire night on repeat was the only way to mark such a glorious occasion. And since that fateful day in 1999, my love for Beyonce has only gotten stronger. And I know I am not the only one. And yes, shout out to the Beehive. And if you don't know who Destiny's Child is, this was the girl group that Beyonce was a part of before she started her solo career. And since then, Beyonce has grown to be one of the best artists of our time. With over 100 million records sold, she's won 20 Grammys. She's become the most nominated woman in Grammy history. She has sold out world tours. She has more statistics and has broken more records than I'm going to use for my entire time today. But Beyonce is a woman at the top of her game, and America has loved her. And on February 6, 2016, Beyonce released a new single, Formation, complete with a music video and a next day Super Bowl halftime performance. Now, most of us are familiar with Beyonce. We've heard her music, we've seen her perform either live or on TV, but this was a different Beyonce. We saw her paying homage to the Black Panthers at the Super Bowl. We saw her standing against police brutality in her Formation video. And this is one of the first times where we didn't see Beyonce singing something like Bootylicious or Single Ladies, and a lot of people didn't like it. The critics came pouring in, and I realized something. America's reaction to Beyonce highlighted a much more subtle, more nuanced issue we have in our country. See, we like Beyonce when she's singing Bootylicious or Single Ladies because she's sassy, she's sexual, and she is a stereotype of what we want Black women to be. But when she shows a less monolithic character of herself, and ultimately of Black women, we didn't like that as much. And now we're in a space and time in our country where racial tensions are high, people are protesting, people are polarized, and what we see every day on our social media feeds and on the news are people standing on extremes of every side of this issue. But I want to argue that a lot of America's problem with race comes from a smaller, more invisible form. Sometimes, I think when we talk about race, a lot of us can think about slavery or former civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, and it feels like a reality of the distant past that has little to do with how we live our everyday lives today. And I want to disagree, and here's why. So Terrence Roberts, he's one of the Little Rock Nine. They were the first 9 students to integrate the Little Rock school system. Well, he talks about a principle that social psychologist Malcolm Gladwell highlights in his book Outliers, except he frames it around race. In the book Outliers, Gladwell talks about something called the 10,000-hour rule. And the 10,000-hour rule is this: if you spend 10,000 hours intentionally practicing something, you become an expert on that thing. But here's the catch. Once you become an expert in something, about 70% of that action gets relegated to your subconscious. You've put in the hours, you've done it enough, and it becomes sort of automatic. For example, if you were to ask gold medal gymnast Simone Biles how she jumps on a 3-inch beam, does a no-handed cartwheel, 4 flips off the back, and lands squarely on her feet, how she does it, she'll only be able to give you about 30% of that answer. Why? She's put in her 10,000 hours, she's become an expert, and when she gets on the beam, her body knows what to do. It becomes automatic. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with race? Well, I want to give you some dates. The first.
So I'm going to stop right here because she goes into a little bit more information, obviously, about 1619, and then certainly some of the more the roles and the status that we have as individuals. But I think what's really interesting, what's important rather about what she's saying is this whole idea of the 10,000-hour rule and how we have done one thing or some things different or differently for about, the last 60 years or so. That is such a very, very short period of time in which we can train ourselves to rethink, redo, dismantle, explore, examine all of the things that we actually want to do in order for us to center and advance equity. And so when you think about that, and one of the reasons why I like this TED Talk is because, well, she's talking about Beyonce, and while I'm not like the biggest fan, I'm not a part of the Beehive. Let me just say it that way. But the whole idea of what Beyonce and her halftime performance and how we expect people to play all of these different roles in our lives, I think that's such a really important piece to how we see ourselves as women of color, as women who are working in nonprofit sectors, as men who might be in a female dominant arena. Like, how do we see ourselves in all of these spaces and these places? And then how are we actually defining who we are in those spaces and places so that we can be very genuine and authentic to how we engage in those alliances, and becoming a really important ally to people. So she's, she talks about this whole 10,000 hour rule and just those particular messages. So I really wanted to bring that into discussion because it does in many ways expand on those ideas about how our human differences are both constructed from the social and the cultural aspects, and then how our human differences are structured from a biological and psychological perspectives, and how all of those things come together, and we are then hopefully afforded a space to really talk about those narratives and those histories. The second thing that I want to share with you all about diversity science really has more to do with inclusion. And it's the way in which all of the different ways in which we understand who we are and then who we are to each other, how all of that really helps us to engage in the difficult conversations, to have those dialogues with people who have different perspectives and ideas about how people operate, the roles that they should have, the expectations we have for who those folks are, and most importantly, the ways in which we are engaging more inclusivity so that we are incorporating more voices, more diverse voices and different perspectives and different thinking into the policies, practices, and the processes that need to be changed. What's important about the ways in which people feel belong, or the ways in which people are have a sense of belonging to their particular spaces, some of it has to do with the ways in which we see each other's discussion and conflict styles. So Tatiana Feidelmeister talks a lot about the ways, the cultural nuances, and even some of the ethnic or racial nuances to our conflict and discussion style that sometimes actually prohibits us from having the conversation. So for example, I am a pretty passionate person, my hands are moving all the time and I'm, doing all this stuff. Well, these are nuances that if this is not what you understand as discussion, then you may see it as I'm in conflict, which I'm really not. I'm just really passionate about what I'm saying and I'm just discussing and I'm animated. Whereas there might be some cultural implications to recognizing that for other folks, their discussion style does not include include a lot of animated, hand moving and behaviors and gestures. And so, it's really understanding that and how are we having these conversations and dialoguing within these particular spaces. And the very last thing that I'll bring into the conversation about diversity science is the ways in which we are messaging who we are, what we understand about each other. Goes back to that definition of humility, freedom of arrogance, assumptions and aesthetic commentary about ourselves and others. And then the messages that we are internalizing as individuals about who we are, who other people are, that can either advance equity or prohibit us from advancing equity. I think the internalized messages is extremely important because it goes back to that whole idea of power imposition and what roles should people play, the status that they should have, the ways in which they can, if you can assimilate and navigate in certain spaces, what does that look like while you are still trying to maintain your genuine, authentic self in all of these spaces. So it really has a lot to do with the ways in which we've internalized messages. I will say the other part of the internalized message is what we have internalized about ourselves that has been given to us by other people. So, for example, in a professionalized setting, what you look like, what you sound like who created those rules? Where do those standards really come from? You know, women were able to move into corporate America spaces when they were able to navigate and assimilate into a white male-dominated culture. As an African-American woman who wears her hair typically in its natural state, I know that there are some spaces, there are some professionalized spaces where it won't be accepted and it's not acceptable. So, you know, all of those things really plays into the internal, the messages that we internalize about self and others. So, diversity science coupled with power imposition, all of those things really ask that you explore a few questions. Now, I don't think we're going to have time for us to get back into groups, but I do want to just offer these questions. And these questions are actually on that Google Doc as well. So you can explore these questions on your own. But it does help you, and it help you to examine and explore how have your experiences really shaped your own thinking, action, and behavior towards others. And it can help you figure out how do you actually want to engage in some of these difficult conversations with other people so that you are creating opportunities for alliances to grow. How do you hold someone else's history and background as a true representation of who they are? How are you actually challenging yourself to deepen your own understanding of self and others, which is where the cultural humility and civility piece comes in, because you really need to figure out how are you engaging in an awareness of others and self, your responsiveness to taking action, and then your sensitivity, the ways in which you're being sensitive to the stories and the narratives and the histories that you hear. And then the last thing is how are you actually constructing a view or a viewpoint or a perspective, and perhaps even challenging the source of some things that have helped shape your perspectives that may not actually be true. It may be generalizations or stereotypes or really support some biases. So when you think about, again, diversity science and looking at all aspects of a person and allowing some space and opportunity for a person to tell you about that history and that story, it really does speak to the ways in which you can have a very authentic and real conversation and use that conversation to create those cross-cultural alliances. So I want to stop right there because we have about 5 minutes. There's so much more to talk about. And I'm certainly willing to have more conversations because this is what I do all the time. I love having these conversations. So, you know, I really want to offer that to you all. If there's anyone who wants to have even more conversations or get a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that we've talked about today, I am more than happy to have those conversations. So I wanted to stop right there and just ask if anyone has any questions. Or if there's anything else that I might be able to address or answer or provide some resources for. I will make the whole presentation available to you all as well, so that you all have an opportunity to kind of walk through it yourself if you'd like to do that.
I can take this opportunity to really embarrass Candice and tell you that she has a book out that just came out that is called Conflict Recovery, and it's all about this, and I'm going to share it in the chat. So if you loved it and you want a whole book of it, you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah, there's a whole book of this stuff.
Well, congratulations, Candice.
Well, thanks.
And thank you for your time with us here today.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate you adding your voices to this conversation. It is a much needed and necessary conversation to have. And so the more often you guys are able to have these conversations in your circles of influence, that's what's going to be most important. It's like it's the difference between having holding a firecracker in the palm of your hand and then putting your fist around it and saying, nope, we're going to do some stuff to disrupt some of this thinking that has not been helping us move forward. So I appreciate you guys for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Candice. And we have one more workshop scheduled for this fall. So I hope that if you all aren't already registered, you'll plan to join us. And that one's on virtual event planning. And it is on November 11th. So if you're not already registered for that one, you can go to uca.edu/outreach/nonprofit. and get registered, and hope to see some of you again soon. Y'all have a good afternoon.
Yay, you too.